What is the real reason for Brunei's refusal to join Malaysia? The refusal of Brunei to join the Federation became a factor in the tense relations between the two countries, especially after the formation of Malaysia, up to 1979, when Tun Abdul Razak died. However, it is the main objective of this chapter to study and determine the crucial reasons for Brunei not joining Malaysia. For the Sultan, the main reason for his refusal to enter Malaysia was his desire to safeguard the interests of the state, the people, and his position as head of state. However, this has been argued by some historians like Pehin Muhammad Jamil, Yusof Damit, Hasim Niyat, or even Brunei political leaders in the 1960s such as Pengiran Ali Muhammad Dud, Dato Mar Sulman and Pengiran Haji Muhammad Yusof, that the issue of oil revenue was one of the major factors in Brunei's refusal to join the Federation. Malaysia, on the other hand, offers a different explanation, that the Sultan's concern was his own status within a federation which operated a rotating kingship. The final meeting between the Bruneian, Malayan, and British governments, which took place in London on September 1963, was an important historical event for Brunei specifically and Malaysia in general. In the end, Brunei refused to join Malaysia. A wise decision. According to the senior minister of Singapore, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, in retrospect, the decision ultimately taken by the Sultan of Brunei in declining to join Malaysia was a wise one. He admitted that, we, Singapore, were wrong because after 2 years, 1965, Singapore was kicked out of the Federation of Malaysia. The first direct meeting between Brunei and Malayan governments. Even though Brunei had been represented in the Malaysia Solidarity Consultative Committee meetings in December 1961 at Kuching and January 1962 in Kuala Lumpur, there had been no direct discussion of Brunei's entry to the Federation. It must be understood that the participation in the Malaysia Solidarity Consultative Committee was not made by the official representatives from the government. It was attended by the individuals, not the government representatives. The first official meeting to discuss the Malaysia proposal between the Bruneian and Malayan governments took place in Kuala Lumpur on July 9, 1962. In this first bilateral meeting in July 1962, the Sultan sent Pengiran Pemancha Muhammad Alam to confer with the Tunku's government. The meeting was informal, and can be divided into 2 stages. Initially, the Bruneian delegation met the Deputy Minister of the Federation, Tun Abdul Razak, and other Malayan officials, and then they discussed the issue with the Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman. The main objective of the discussion was to try and clarify the form of association Brunei will have with Malaysia on a broader pattern. The meeting focused on the advantages Brunei would secure after joining Malaysia. The issue of Brunei's security in Southeast Asian international politics was also discussed. Brunei insists to safeguard his position and monarchical rule. On September 25, 1962, a formal meeting was held between the Brunei and Malayan governments. A delegation from Brunei went to Kuala Lumpur to examine the various facets of the Malaysia Plan, and the position of Brunei therein, and to make recommendations to the Sultan. In the meeting, the Brunei delegation stressed that within the Federation, Brunei's position should be regarded as different from those of the other territories such as North Borneo and Sarawak, or the existing Malayan states. However, the Deputy Prime Minister of Malaya, Tun Abdul Razak, said that within the Federation, all member states would be treated equally. As we can see here, there is a difference in the proposed idea between the Bruneian and Malayan, on how the design of the new Federation of Malaysia will looks like. For the Malayans, their design of Malaysia in relation with the Borneo territories, as has been proposed in their propaganda vehicle, Malaysia Solidarity Consultative Committee, will consist of simple federation. The Malayans want to create a simple federation with the Borneo territories of Brunei, Sarawak, and North Borneo, which will comprise of 14 states, by simply adding the existing 11 states of Malaya with Brunei, Sarawak, and North Borneo. Whereas, all of these 14 states will be treated equally. Meanwhile, the Bruneian know that the proposed simple federation by the Malayans will degrade the status of Brunei to be merely equal with the other 11 states of Malaya. Here, the Bruneian want the status of Brunei to be equal with the Federation of Malaya, not to be equal with the other 11 states of Malaya. Here, clearly, the Bruneian was on the right. In the end, the Malaysia Agreement 1963 that was signed on July 9, 1963 in London, provide for the equal partnership between the Federation of Malaya, Singapore, Sarawak, and Sabah. In the meeting of September 25, 1962, in addition to safeguarding the position of Brunei, the Brunei delegation also insists to retain their traditional character of monarchical rule. However, the Malayan leaders looked unfavorably on an attempt from the Brunei side to maintain its traditional character of monarchical rule. Having in his mind that Brunei should join in the formation of Malaysia through simple federation, Ghazali Shafi argued that it would be impossible for a state like Brunei to retain its traditional character if it was to practice democracy like other states in the Federation of Malaysia. Ghazali Shafi, as permanent secretary in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, stated that if Brunei insisted on retaining its traditional government, then it was better that Brunei should not join Malaysia. Furthermore, he argued that the proposed Federation of Malaysia would need a strong central government, therefore Brunei would, mutatis mutandis, have to make certain sacrifices for the common good. On the other hand, the Brunei delegation continued to uphold its stance that Brunei was not prepared to lose the existing constitutional authority and powers of the Sultan. Thus, if Brunei was not prepared to hold an election in order to create a representative form of government, it would be difficult for the Malayan government to accept any demands from the Brunei side. Generally, the Malayan government found it hard to accept Brunei's proposal to maintain its traditional system of government. But, Tun Razak gave an assurance that the Malayan government was prepared for further talks with the Brunei delegation. Brunei accepting Malaysia proposal in principle. Subsequent to the September 25, 1962 meeting, on December 5, 1962, the Sultan announced to the Brunei Legislative Council meeting that he accepted in principle the Malaysia Plan. Provided agreement was reached on certain important conditions affecting matters of benefit and advantage to the people and the state of Brunei. By this proclamation, the Sultan gave a mandate to the Brunei State Council to discuss the proposal with the Malayan and British governments. The Legislative Council then voted to accept by 22-4, with one abstention, a motion endorsing the Sultan's message, and supporting, in principle, Brunei's participation in a Malaysian federation. The members of the council also advised the Sultan that the acceptance of Brunei's entry should be determined by the terms which bring benefits to the state of Brunei and do not diminish the status of Brunei as a constitutional state. The Sultan on the importance of Malaysia proposal. After the Brunei Rebellion in December 1962, meetings between the two governments continued. In January 1963, the Sultan announced his intention to send a delegation to Kuala Lumpur to discuss further the conditions for Brunei's entry into Malaysia. The Malayan government took this opportunity to implore the Sultan to study carefully the terms set by Brunei if it wanted to join the new Federation of Malaysia. Before leaving on January 15, 1963, the Sultan tried to convince his subjects that the Malaysia proposal was important for the future of Brunei, but yet again that if Malaysia did not hold out the prospect of benefit to the state and the people of Brunei, then he would decline to join. As the Sultan said, "It concerns the future destiny of my people and citizens all over Brunei. The purpose of this visit is to negotiate the terms for our beloved Brunei's entry into Malaysia. The terms regarding Brunei's entry into Malaysia is a very important issue, for it is related to the future destiny, peace, and well-being of all my people and citizens. I hope my people realize its importance." The high-ranking meetings between Brunei and Malaya. The high-ranking official meeting between the Brunei and Malayan governments took place from February 5 to March 3, 1963, in Kuala Lumpur. Members of the Brunei delegation left for Kuala Lumpur in early January and also February 3, 1963. The Brunei delegation was led by Pangeran Dato Sensia Haji Muhammad Ali, Deputy Chief Minister, Idris Talik Davies, Attorney General, Pangeran Dato Sensia Haji Muhammad Yusof, Deputy State Secretary, Pangeran Dato Sensia Haji Muhammad, Director of Telecommunications. Haji Awang Muhammad Jamil, Chairman of Education Committee, Dato Patuk Anil Lawson Queen Council, Constitutional Advisor to the Sultan. The Malayan delegation was led by Tun Razak, who was assisted by Tan Su Sin, the Minister of Finance. The agenda of the meeting was to discuss various issues such as finance, Brunei's revenue and taxation, the Sultan's position in the Council of Rulers, the special rights and privileges of the Brunei people and the representation of Brunei in the Federal Parliament. The meeting was divided into two sessions. The first session comprised formal lobbying to discuss the basic draft relating to an agreement and also to prepare an agenda for the formal meeting. The formal meeting started on February 8, when two committees were set up. Brunei's delegation met the Tunku and several cabinet ministers of the Federation of Malaya at Rumah Awang Alak Baidatar, the Sultan's palace in Kuala Lumpur. The Tunku personally stressed that there would be no change in the Malayan stance regarding Brunei's position in the Federation, whereas his government would treat Brunei as an equal partner with other states in the Federation of Malaysia. Two working committees were set up to deal with constitutional and financial matters separately. One was known as the Constitutional and General Matters Working Committee, and the other as the Finance Working Committee. The first committee met 3 times and the second committee 5 times. Both sides were satisfied with the results of the meeting. As Pangeran Haji Muhammad Yusof said, the prospect of Brunei joining Malaysia was much better than before. Furthermore, he said that the meeting was the first and the last because the Sultan had already given his consent in principle for Brunei to join Malaysia. High-ranking Bruneian officials believed it was only a matter of time before Brunei joined Malaysia, but they could not predict the date when this would happen. The Tunku expected that the signing of the agreement would take place after the return of Tun Razak from the London meeting. Thus, both sides seemed confident that Brunei genuinely wanted to join Malaysia. Even the Sultan indicated that Brunei would join Malaysia soon, as he said, "I am very satisfied with the outcome of the talks. They were concluded in an atmosphere of friendliness and understanding. We will definitely join Malaysia by August 31 this year." With regard to the special position of the Brunei Sultan and his subjects, the Malayan government guaranteed that a provision would be written into the constitution of the new federation, so that the Brunei government could spend its revenues on education and welfare for the people of the state. And the Sultan's subjects would be treated in the same way as Malaysian citizens. As regards parliamentary representation, Brunei would be given 10 seats in the federal parliament. This number was acceptable to the Brunei government with regard to the proportional principle, in that the representatives from Brunei were more than enough to voice the interests of a population of fewer than 100,000. The dispute. But in reality, and despite the apparently encouraging public statements, the results of the meetings actually did not indicate a bright prospect for Brunei entering Malaysia. Two issues, the financial one and that of the Sultan's position, remained unresolved. They were, in fact, major issues that proved intractable. The disagreement over Brunei's financial contribution to the federal government mainly focused on the amount of the contribution, what it should be called, and the minimum period over which the financial arrangements should apply to the central government. The dispute was not only between the Sultan and the Tunku but also between the Sultan and his constitutional advisor. According to Pehin Haji Muhammad Jamil, chairman of the Education Committee, Dato Patuk Neil Lawson, constitutional advisor to the Sultan, and even Pengiran Ali Muhammad Dud, deputy chief minister, tried to persuade the Sultan to accept Malaya's terms. But the Sultan declined to accept their suggestion. According to Pehin Haji Muhammad Jamil, the Sultan was annoyed by Pengiran Ali's advice. Neil Lawson also always argued with the Sultan on the issue of the terms and amount of the contribution and the question of imposing taxes on mineral resources in Brunei, other than oil. The dispute, oil revenue and Brunei contribution. Regarding the financial issue, Brunei wanted to control her own revenues from oil. It has been being agreed by the Malayan government that there should be special protection for the oil wealth and the reserves of Brunei. Dato Lawson emphasized that Brunei did not want other people to control her own revenue. At the same time, the Sultan discussed the financial issue with the Tunku personally. On the question of Brunei's contribution, the Sultan emphasized that it was up to Brunei to decide the amount and the terms of the contribution. The Sultan added that he agreed to give $40 million of Brunei's annual revenue, which totaled about $90 million, but the contribution should be known as an annual voluntary donation. For defense, the Sultan would make an additional outright contribution of $5 million only in the first year of Malaysia's formation. However, the Malayan government did not accept Brunei's offer of $40 million per annum and argued that $5 million for the first year was not enough to cover the cost of handling Brunei's foreign affairs, defense and internal security expenditure. On this issue, the British official at the Colonial Office argued that if Brunei did not join Malaysia, the Malayan government would get nothing. Therefore, it would be better if the Malayan government accepted the terms offered by Brunei, in order to get something. Furthermore, the federal government could decide for themselves how much they could spend on Brunei. The inclusion of Brunei would not materially affect federal defense expenditure. Tan Soo Sin, Malayan's Minister of Finance, produced figures which showed that the Federation government would be subsidizing Brunei to the extent of $11 million a year. Federal expenditure on services would be $29 million, on additional defense $20 million and on internal security $10 million, a total of $59 million, against which should be set Brunei's $40 million annual contribution to the Federation. The Sultan, for his part, argued that it would be impossible to estimate exactly the amount of expenditure incurred for the defense and internal security of Brunei. As Ghazali said, the Sultan said that the Tunku's suggestions were quite unrealistic compared to what was claimed to have been already agreed to in the schedule to the proposed Malaysia agreement. The Sultan was generous enough to offer a handout of $40 million to meet the immediate problems that the creation of Malaysia might entail. Furthermore, the Tunku argued that if oil revenue was excluded, the taxable capacity of Brunei would be very small, and it was fair for the central government to share in any additional revenue that accrued in Brunei, because every year the revenue from oil would increase. So the Malayan government proposed that after the end of the 10-year period, the full federal tax arrangement should apply to Brunei. According to some sources, Tan Sri Sin played an important role in making Brunei refuse to join Malaysia. This was because in the meeting he proposed that after 10 years the federal government should control Brunei's oil revenue. Tunku Abdul Rahman regretted this suggestion. The dispute, the term for financial contribution. On the question of the term by which the financial contribution would be known, the federal government also argued that Brunei's contribution should be referred to as a gift, hadiah, and not a voluntary donation, sumbangan sukarela. The Sultan rejected this suggestion on the ground that if voluntary donation was replaced by annual gift, then it would be a form of tribute which implied that Brunei was a vassal of the Federation. Then, the Tunku suggested another term, which he thought would be appropriate and acceptable to the Sultan, namely, an annual contribution. Unfortunately, no agreement was reached regarding the contribution issue. A British official from the Far Eastern Department of the Foreign Office in London said, "The Sultan is reluctant to describe the $40 million annual payment as an annual contribution. He wishes the phraseology to reflect the voluntary nature of the payment. Lawson has advised him that the words annual contribution should be in English, and that any verbal refinements should be for the Malay text." The Sultan told Lawson that this will not be a sticking point if all other matters are settled, but the High Commissioner is not so sure. The Tunku's attorney, Dato Sheridan, made some alteration to the wording and showed it to Dato Patuka Neil Lawson for his views. Dato Lawson replied that he would make the wording better than that, but wondered what would be the suitable Malay words for the alterations if the agreement was drawn up in the Malay language. Upon hearing this, Dato Sheridan immediately withdrew his suggestions and everybody was silent except the Malayan Minister of Home Affairs, Dato Dr. Ismail, who nodded his head in agreement. The Tunku then informed the Sultan that he would consult his cabinet before further discussion regarding Brunei's financial contribution. The dispute, the Sultan position. Aside from the financial issues, the main problem in the talks apparently arose when the Brunei delegation demanded that the Sultan should be a member of the Conference of Rulers, on the same footing as the rulers of the other Malay states. The Sultan's position in the list should be based on the date of his accession to the throne, 1950, not on the date that Brunei joined Malaysia. The Brunei delegation argued that, since the Federation of Malaysia would be a new nation and not a continuing federation, All rulers including the Brunei Sultan should take their places in the order of precedence according to the date when they ascended the thrones of their respective states. However, in March 1963, the Conference of Rulers had already decided that the precedence and the position of the Sultan of Brunei should relate to the date of Brunei's accession to Malaysia. So his name would be the last in the election to be appointed as a Yang di-Pertuan Agong of the new Federation of Malaysia. Like the financial issue, this too seemed to be one without any resolution. The dispute, any compromise? Overall, the Brunei government wanted the Malayan government to guarantee that the special position of the Brunei Sultan and his subjects would be safeguarded by provisions to be written in the constitution of the new federation, agreed by the Malayan government. This would mean, inter alia, that the Brunei government should continue to retain its oil reserves and its substantial accumulation of investments. Dato Lawson said that there should be special protection for the oil wealth and the revenues of Brunei, and that she should be entitled to spend what she earns. The people would also continue to enjoy certain social benefits and free education which were absent in other states. That is why, in all meetings, the Tunku tried to compromise with Brunei's demands in order to persuade the Sultan to come to an agreement with the Malayan terms. As he said, "I do not like to prejudice that issue. But I would say this, Malaya will show the same generosity to Brunei as it has shown to Sarawak and North Borneo." Although there was still clearly disagreement on the financial and precedence issues, both governments were convinced that the outcome of the meeting was positive. The Sultan said that he still agreed in principle to join Malaysia, provided the conditions offered by the Malayan government would benefit the people and state of Brunei. The Borneo Bulletin reported that the Malayan government had given assurances of the special position of Brunei people and on other matters relating on the Sultan's position and the Brunei Constitution. Brunei's Deputy Chief Minister, Penyiran Dato Senchia Haji Ali, also said that the meeting had come to an agreement on the conditions for Brunei joining the Federation. Speaking to the people of Tutong and Balate district on the result of the meeting, he said, "Within the Federation of Malaysia, you should not be worried especially about the income tax and other privileges that you are receiving at the moment. Old age pensions and benefits for disabled, blind and other needy people will still be maintained. Joining Malaysia shouldn't mean that we sell our beloved state to Malaya or make Brunei a colony of Malaya." The other main question which could not be resolved, concerned the arrangements after a 10-year period with regard to the financial agreements which would apply. This issue was deferred for discussion until the next meeting. As regards finance, the Brunei government had already indicated that within the Federation, Brunei wants to keep its oil revenues in perpetuity, although the Malayan government had tried to press for direct control over the revenues after 10 years had elapsed. Therefore, Brunei considered the financial issue to be an important one which had to be resolved by both parties. From the point of view of the Sultan, if the conditions of entry in respect of the prosperity and welfare of the people of Brunei were not acceptable, the participation of Brunei in Malaysia would be a retrograde step. The ultimatum, the impasse in the final negotiation. On June 8, 1963, Dato Marcel bin Mon, Chief Minister, led the Brunei delegation to continue the negotiations with the Tunku and his cabinet. Members of the delegation were Pengiran Dato Sensia Haji Muhammad Ali, Deputy Chief Minister, Pengiran Dato Sensia Haji Muhammad Yusof, Deputy Secretary of State, Dato Paduka Neil Lawson Queen Counsel, Constitutional Advisor to the Sultan, Idris Talik Davies, Attorney General. John Lee, State Financial Officer, Haji Muhammad Jamil Umar, Chairman of Education Committee, and Awang Isa bin Pehin Datu Perdana Menteri Haji Ibrahim, interpreter. However, the negotiations reached an impasse. The Brunei delegation said that they needed to consult the Sultan on the entitlement to any revenue arising from new sources, including new oil discoveries made during the 10-year period. Dato Lawson sent a telegram requesting the Sultan to come immediately to Kuala Lumpur. On June 15, the Sultan and his entourage flew to Kuala Lumpur to join the Brunei delegation in the final negotiations regarding Brunei's entry into Malaysia. On June 17, 1963, a meeting took place between the Tunku and the Sultan in the Cabinet Room in the Parliament building. At this juncture, there were 4 important issues still to be resolved that did not include the issue of precedence. 1. The question of new oil discoveries during the 10-year period of Brunei joining the Federation. 2. The term, annual voluntary donation. 3. The question of mines and minerals, and 4. The question of the arrangements after the first 10 years of Brunei's membership of the Federation. During this meeting, the Sultan was asked to replace the word annual voluntary donation the word annual voluntary gift. Secondly, it was suggested that the annual payment of 40 million ringgit imposed on Brunei would be reviewed again after 10 years. Both the suggestions were rejected by the Sultan. As regards the financial issue, Brunei agreed that there would be a review 10 years after Brunei joined Malaysia, but it would not include the reserves. In regard to the reserves, Brunei invested its money overseas, mostly in the United Kingdom. The investments were handled by a Crown agent until 1979, when the Brunei Investment Agency, BIA, was established. In addition, Brunei was not prepared to accept terms that imposed an obligation to pay a share of revenues from future oil discoveries. No agreement was reached and the negotiations ended in a deadlock. Dato Lawson, the Sultan's constitutional advisor, said, "Last February, 1963, the Sultan had received an assurance from the Federation that the special interests of Brunei would be protected. Subsequently, negotiations in Kuala Lumpur had resulted in drafts of agreement. This, however, was followed by a letter from the Tunku to His Highness the Sultan, and further exchanges, which showed that there were in fact wide differences between Malaya and Brunei. Negotiations were resumed in Kuala Lumpur in June, but the results have been unsatisfactory. Thus, it was already clear there was still disagreement between the two governments about the issues of future oil discoveries in Brunei, taxation of mines and minerals, and the appropriate name for and amount of the annual contribution. The ultimatum, the Sultan felt bitter and left immediately. After the deadlock in the final negotiation in Kuala Lumpur, Tunku Abdul Rahman then gave a grace period of 48-hour deadline to the Brunei government, to consider whether they wanted to join the Federation of Malaysia. He then left Kuala Lumpur for Kedah. When the Sultan was told about this, he immediately ordered the Brunei delegation to return home without waiting for the 48-hour deadline. On June 19, the Sultan and his entourage flew home to Brunei in a British Royal Air Force plane. The Sultan returned to Brunei immediately after the Tunku made an embarrassing remark in reply to the Sultan's suggestion that Brunei would enter Malaysia on the basis of a loose federation. The Tunku replied by saying that it was better for Brunei not to join Malaysia. Pehin Orang Kaya Digadong Haji Abdul Rahman, who also attended the meeting in Kuala Lumpur, said that the Sultan was very angry with the Tunku's statement, that if Brunei wanted to join on the basis of a loose federation, which Pehin termed co-federation, then it would be better for Brunei not to join. The Sultan felt bitter and left immediately, and said that in future he would not come to Kuala Lumpur just to discuss Brunei's conditions for joining Malaysia. This gave every indication that the Sultan had already made up his mind not to join Malaysia. At Kuala Lumpur International Airport, the Sultan was sought out by Malayan cabinet members led by Tun Abdul Razak. Having consulted his cabinet about the unresolved matters, Tun Razak asked the Sultan's permission to present a letter to the Brunei delegation. The Sultan, however, refused to accept it. Apparently, the letter was then sent to Brunei by post on June 21, 1963. It contained an ultimatum from the Federation government which can be summarized as follows. A. The Brunei government was to pay annual tax to the Malayan government on any new sources of revenue from oil fields discovered after the first 5 years of the initial period of membership of Malaysia. B. The Malayan government agreed to review Brunei's annual contribution, provided that Brunei accepted A. above. C. In the event of Brunei's default in paying the annual contribution of $40 million at any time during the first 10 years, Articles 109 and 110 of the Constitution would apply, for example, full federal powers over taxation, but Brunei could opt to retain a special concession on oil provided that such retention was agreed by the federal government. D. The Malayan government proposed that the special financial arrangements would be reviewed after 10 years. In default of agreement, then the existing arrangements would be continued. This proposal was made subject to acceptance of the proposal made in A. above regarding new sources of revenue including oil fields which may arise at any time after the first 5 years of the initial 10-year period had lapsed. E. The Malayan government was not prepared to agree that mines and minerals other than oil in Brunei should be exempted from federal taxation, but would give an undertaking that any taxing powers vested in federal government in respect of mines and minerals and of profits to be derived from working thereof will not be used to prevent proper exploitation of Brunei's resources in this sector of the economy, and F. The Malayan government proposed that the sum of $40 million should be described in English as an annual contribution and that in the Malay version this should be translated precisely. The ultimatum, the Sultan reply. According to Tunku Abdul Rahman, the basic principles within the Federation of Malaysia allowed for no special exception. All member states had equal duties, rights, and responsibilities to the central government as units of the Federation. If there was inequality of treatment among the member states, the proposed Federation of Malaysia would become a very strange federation. In practice, however, the central government did not deal equally with its member states, especially Sabah, Sarawak, and Singapore. On the matter of precedence, Ghazali Shafa said that the Sultan agreed to discuss his position later and suggested that the meeting should proceed with other important issues for Brunei. Even in Tun Abdul Razak's ultimatum, which was sent to Brunei on June 21, 1963, this issue was not mentioned. This may suggest that it had already been decided by the Conference of Rulers that the position of the Brunei Sultan would be last on the list. On June 21, a Malayan newspaper reported that the Brunei delegation was disappointed with the latest development and regarded the Tunku's press statement on the latest offer as closing all doors for further negotiations. This report was true because when the Sultan suggested some kind of loose federation to the Tunku, the latter had already indicated that the door was closed for Brunei to join Malaysia. This might be the reason why the Sultan was reluctant to accept the letter given to him by Tun Abdul Razak at the airport, because the Sultan considered that the meeting between the two governments had already ended. Furthermore, the Sultan had also ordered the members of the Brunei delegation not to accept Tun Abdul Razak's letter. The Sultan replied to the letter on June 29, 1963, saying that he could not accept the proposals of the Malayan government, even as a basis for further discussion. The Sultan might have accepted the proposals if they had conformed with the basic principles of Brunei's terms and accorded with the assurances which had been given to him regarding the special position of Brunei. This was indicated in his reply to Tun Abdul Razak, as he said, "My friend, thank you for your letter dated June 21, which I received in Brunei on June 23, 1963. The proposals contained in your above-quoted letter are so incompatible with the basic principles set out in my official statement issued on the morning of June 21, 1963 that I regret to say that I find them unacceptable even as a basis for further negotiations." The 48-hour deadline given by the Tunku to the Sultan of Brunei became a front-page leader in the Malayan newspaper. It stated that whether or not the final offer was accepted by Brunei, the government of the Federation of Malaya would still stick to the decision to end all negotiations. It said that the final offer had been deliberated over for 3 hours and decided by the Malayan cabinet in the operations room of the Ministry of Rural Development, and was submitted to the Sultan of Brunei on the very next day. Nadzar Nong, a spokesman for the leader of the People's Party of Malaya, said that the 48-hour deadline given by the Tunku to the Sultan of Brunei to join Malaysia was an ultimatum unacceptable to Brunei as it ignored the wishes of its people. Meanwhile, Pengiran Dato Sensia Haji Muhammad Yusof made the following comments on the ultimatum. All the while Brunei had shown great interest in joining Malaysia. Not only were we willing to shuttle to and from Kuala Lumpur, but even our Sultan also readily made himself available to come to Kuala Lumpur so that negotiation could be concluded smoothly. However, if Malaya does not wish to accept us, what can we do? Brunei had never shown itself as desiring to withdraw from the proposal to merge with the Federation of Malaysia. Evidently, neither side wanted to lose. The Malayan government felt that the Brunei side should agree with its proposals if they were genuinely interested in joining Malaysia. On the other hand, the Brunei side thought they had the right to set terms that were acceptable to the Sultan and the government. Informally, the Sultan's decision on the Malayan ultimatum, that Brunei would not join the Federation of Malaysia, was final.